It was January 1993, a night like any other in the quiet suburb of Palatine, Illinois. Strip malls shuttered, traffic lights flicked through empty intersections, and a thin veil of snow clung to the asphalt. Brown's Chicken and Pasta glowed faintly against the darkness, its neon sign promising warmth, food, and routine comfort. But inside that little restaurant, the clock was ticking towards something unthinkable. By dawn, the building would be sealed by police tape, its kitchen floor slick with blood, its freezer transformed into a tomb. 7 lives would vanish into silence, and a community would never again feel the same. For years, the question clung to Palatine like frost on glass. Who could do such a thing and why? A paper bag sat crumpled on the sticky tile floor, smeared with grease from the last meals ever served. French fries had spilled across it like brittle yellow bones, cold and limp under the humming fluorescent light. And there, just a few feet away, lay the silence of 7 extinguished lives. It wasn't the kind of scene you expect in a sleepy suburb. This was Palatine, Illinois, the kind of town where Friday nights meant mall food courts and rental VHS tapes, not police tape fluttering against the February wind. Yet when officers finally pushed through the doors of Brown's Chicken and Pasta, what they found resembled something closer to a nightmare than a restaurant closing shift. Behind the counter, the owners, Richard and Lynn Ellenfelt, were slumped, cut down in the place they had built together. In the freezer, stacked like discarded objects, were 5 more employees. Teenagers and 20-somethings who had clocked in that evening expecting nothing worse than boredom and minimum wage monotony. Instead, they were forced into a final huddle of terror, pressed together in a steel tomb, their lives stolen in minutes. No cash drawer dispute, no simple theft, no clean getaway. Whoever did this didn't just want money. They wanted annihilation. And for 9 long years, that's exactly what the crime became. A void. No weapon recovered. No clear suspects. Only the memory of a massacre rotting away in the files of a police department running out of leads. The most chilling part? The killers walked out with little more than pocket change and a bag of chicken scraps. 7 people gone for food and a few bills. And then silence. Palatine went back to its routines, pretending to forget. But grease leaves stains, and so does blood. Every local who drove past the boarded-up Browns the years that followed swore they could still smell the fear, that faint metallic tang that never washes off. And even now, decades later, the question gnaws. How does such a small, suburban corner of the world become the setting for one of the deadliest fast food massacres in American history? The answer hides in that freezer, in that grease-stained bag, in the careless smirk of a killer who thought they'd gotten away with it. 1993 was supposed to be forgettable, not flashy like the 80s, not chaotic like the 70s, just a bland, suburban grayness where families clung to routine as if it were religion. Palatine, Illinois, about 30 miles northwest of Chicago, was the epitome of that safe American illusion. A town where cul-de-sacs curled like question marks, where kids played basketball in driveways until porch lights flicked on, and where the scariest thing that happened at night was a neighbor's dog breaking off its leash. And yet, that year, America was quietly falling apart at the seams. The economy was sluggish, jobs were shaky, and fast food joints had become both sanctuary and trap. For teenagers, they were the first rung on the ladder of adulthood. Clock in, fry something, wipe down the counter, repeat. For adults, they were a last resort, one more desperate attempt to keep bills from piling high. Brown's Chicken and Pasta fit neatly into that landscape, a family-owned franchise, greasy comfort food, fluorescent lighting that flattened every shadow. The Ellenfelts, Richard and Lynn, embodied the suburban dream. They were middle-aged, responsible, committed to their business. They wanted their shop to be more than a pit stop for fried chicken. To them, it was a symbol of stability in an unstable world. Their employees, teenagers mostly, were faces you could see in any high school hallway. College hopefuls, music fans, kids saving for their first cars. Their lives were ordinary in the kind of way that feels indestructible. And Palatine itself, let's not romanticize it. The town wasn't glamorous. It wasn't dangerous either. It existed in that in-between space, the kind of place people drive through on their way to somewhere else. But here's the paradox. Ordinary places are fragile. They crack under the slightest pressure, and when they do, the breakage is violent, shocking, impossible to reconcile. The night of January 8th, 1993, didn't announce itself as historic. Temperatures were freezing. Snow clung to the ground, and the Brown's Chicken on Northwest Highway bustled with its usual end-of-week traffic. By 9 p.m., the dinner rush had thinned. By 10 p.m., most customers had gone home. At 11 p.m., the doors had been locked, lights dimmed, and the small crew inside free to joke, sweep, and dream about tomorrow. But tomorrow never came. What makes Palatine so haunting isn't that it was plagued with crime. It's that it wasn't. This was not Chicago's South Side. This was not some notorious corner riddled with gangs. This was suburbia. Middle-class suburbia, where parents trusted their kids would return home after late shift, where nobody locked their doors until after midnight, where murder was a story you watched on the evening news about strangers in other states. Until, of course, it wasn't. To grasp the true way of this crime, you have to look beyond the number 7. You have to see the people, ordinary men and women whose stories stopped mid-sentence inside that restaurant. Richard and Lynn Ellenfelt weren't moguls chasing empires. They were middle-aged dreamers, searching for stability through one of the most familiar American paths, running a franchise. Their Brown's Chicken wasn't a gold mine. It was supposed to be steady, predictable, a safe place to build a modest life. They weren't gamblers. They were providers, building a small foundation in a town where safety was assumed to be the rule. And then there were the employees, teenagers mostly. Think about your first job. The smell of fryer grease clinging to your clothes, the monotony of closing duties, the quiet camaraderie of kids laughing while sweeping floors. Those places aren't supposed to be dangerous. They're supposed to be awkward stepping stones into adulthood. Michael Castro was only 16, a high school band kid, balancing schoolwork, music, and his first taste of responsibility. His parents expected him home that night, maybe with the usual reminder about curfew. He never made it back. There was 18-year-old Marcus Nelson, restless with the kind of suburban energy that fills late-night parking lots. There was Guadalupe Maldonado, 46, a father of 3 who had left Mexico to give his children a better future. Proof that fast food jobs aren't just for kids, but sometimes for survival. And then there were Thomas Menace and Rico Solis, both teenagers, both working another forgettable shift. Except this one became the last line of their story. 7 lives, 7 different orbits of family, friendship, and quiet dreams, all cut short under fluorescent lights. None of them woke up that morning sensing doom. They brushed their teeth, packed their bags, maybe argued with siblings, maybe planned for the weekend. That ordinariness is what makes the savagery impossible to reconcile. This wasn't a mob hit. This wasn't an assassination designed for power or revenge. It was everyday life. The Ellenfelts and their crew stepping into a routine Friday night shift. The faith that work would be safe, that life would be ordinary. That was a trust their killers shattered. It's easy in retellings to let the phrase 7 victims flatten into abstraction. But here's the uncomfortable truth. They were as ordinary as alive as you are right now reading this. And it's precisely that ordinariness that makes what happened inside Brown's Chicken so grotesque. The first signal that something was wrong came not from inside the restaurant, but from outside, from absence. Richard and Lynn didn't come home. Phones went unanswered. Parents waiting for their teenagers paced the living rooms. staring at the clock, that dread building slowly, irrationally at first, then with a suffocating weight. By the next morning, the Ellenfeld's car was still parked outside Brown's, and employees' families started making frantic calls. Something was off. At 11 a.m. on January 9th, police finally forced their way into the restaurant. What they stepped into was not merely a crime scene. It was a silent graveyard of grease and fluorescent light. Chairs set neatly in place, as if nothing had happened. A mop leaned in the corner, still damp from the final cleaning routine. Everything looked eerily normal, until you stepped into the back. That's where the nightmare revealed itself. Behind the counter, Richard and Lynn were found collapsed. The freezer door was shut tight, but inside was a real horror. 5 young employees stacked together as though they had been packed away like inventory. Their bodies were stiff, their lives stolen, in a place that smelled of thawing meat and fryer oil. And yet, nothing else made sense. The cash register had been emptied, but only about $1,800 was gone. Pocket change compared to the price of 7 human lives. There were half-eaten scraps of chicken left behind, as if someone had casually dined after committing the act. That detail, small as it sounds, is one of the most grotesque. Killers who sat down to eat while their victims lay cold in the next room. Palatine wasn't ready for this. The police weren't ready. Nobody could reconcile it. Murders happen in Chicago, sure, but not here, not in a suburban fast food joint staffed by kids and parents working part-time jobs. The very randomness of it made the massacre feel supernatural, as if violence itself had drifted down from the city and infected a quiet neighborhood. Parents stopped letting their children work night shifts. Customers looked twice at the people sitting across from them in diners. Palatine's illusion of safety shattered overnight, and in its place came paranoia. The hardest part was the silence. Neighbors reported no gunshots, no screams, no alarms triggered. Just an unassuming restaurant sitting quietly by the roadside, holding inside it the stillness of 7 extinguished lives. It was a kind of silence that spreads, not just across a town, but into the bones of everyone who hears the story. The silence of a freezer that became a coffin. The silence of families waiting at the window for someone who would never come home. From the very first day, the case refused to behave. Normally, with a crime this brutal, you expect noise, witnesses, rumors, someone bragging at a bar. But the Brown's chicken murders slipped into the public record like a ghost. No one saw the killers leave. No neighbors reported suspicious cars. The only evidence inside the restaurant was smeared footprints, empty cash drawers, and most disturbingly, a half-eaten piece of chicken abandoned in its greasy box. That chicken would become infamous. At first, it was just another revolting detail. Murderers eating fried food after taking lives. But years later, it would prove to be the very thread that unraveled the silence. Still, in 1993, all it did was mock investigators, as if the killers had left a souvenir behind simply to sneer at their incompetence. Theories flooded Palatine like static. Was this a mob hit gone sloppy? The Chicago outfit had always loomed in the background of suburban business life. Or was it random thrill seekers? Kids who wanted to see what it felt like to take lives? Others whispered about disgruntled employees, ex-workers nursing grudges. The police interrogated everyone. Ex-boyfriends, former staff, anyone who had ever fought with Richard or Lynn. Nothing stuck. The press swarmed the town. Palatine was suddenly a stage for national horror, with cameras pointed at the boarded-up Browns, at crying parents, at police chiefs giving the same hollow statements on repeat. No suspects. Investigation ongoing. The building itself turned into a haunted monument. Families driving by would avert their eyes, pretending not to see the yellow walls, still standing there like a tombstone. And then came the paranoia. Every fast food joint in the area felt cursed. Customers eyed employees with suspicion. Parents begged their kids to quit jobs at McDonald's or Burger King. The idea of being trapped in a back room by strangers became every worker's private nightmare. Safety, always fragile, was exposed as a fantasy. The weirdest detail? The killers left almost nothing behind. The restaurant wasn't ransacked. There were no wild signs of a struggle. It was as though the crime had been carried out with mechanical efficiency, punctuated only by the grotesque pause to snack on chicken. That's what gnawed at people most. The randomness, the cruelty that seemed casual, the fact that 7 people could vanish into silence, their lives reduced to an itemized police report, while perpetrators walked free, maybe blending into the crowd at a local grocery store, maybe sitting right next to you on the train, smelling faintly of fryer oil. The Browns massacre wasn't just a crime. It was a question mark burned into the heart of Palatine, one that mocked investigators and terrorized the public. What kind of person does this, and how do they disappear back into ordinary life without a trace? The investigation should have been straightforward. 7 lives stolen, a small restaurant, limited entry points. It should have been solvable. Instead, it became a labyrinth, each hallway leading to a dead end. Detectives tore apart the crime scene, cataloging everything from fingerprints to the grease-stained floor tiles. The register was empty, sure, but the killers hadn't bothered to take anything else of value. Jewelry was left behind. A watch, even the night's receipts. Why take the cash and nothing more? That single inconsistency spawned its own set of theories. Maybe this wasn't about robbery at all. The chicken bones mocked them. Found discarded in a trash can, gnawed clean, greasy fingerprints pressed against the box. At the time, DNA analysis was still crawling forward, not yet the miracle tool it would later become. The detectives stored the remains, bagged and sealed, never realizing they were holding the single most important clue of the case. But in 1993, technology lagged and suspicion grew elsewhere. The mob theory lingered like cigarette smoke. Some whispered that Richard Ellenfelt might have crossed the wrong people, an unpaid debt, a business slight. Others suspected disgruntled employees. Restaurants churned through staff like butter, and Palatine police grilled every ex-worker they could find. One was even dragged to the media circus, his name stained by whispers before being cleared. For months, the case spun like a carousel of rumor. It must have been outsiders. No, it was someone local. No, it was professionals who knew how to control a crime scene. Each theory only deepened the unease, because if it was outsiders, then Palatine had been randomly chosen. If it was insiders, then trust itself had been poisoned. The FBI was called in, profiling the killers with clinical detachment. Their theory? 2 people, young men, impulsive but cruel, feeding off each other's energy. Not professionals, not mobsters, but thrill seekers chasing violence for its own sake. That profile would prove eerily accurate. But at the time, it was just another paper in a growing file. Public pressure mounted. 7 coffins in 1 week tend to do that. Candlelight vigils turned into protests. Parents demanding justice. Police cars circled the suburbs like wardens, as if their flashing lights could ward off the specter of whoever had done this. But days became weeks, weeks became months, and the case went cold. Not cold like a mystery novel, cold like the freezer where 5 of the victims were found. The file stacked higher, dust thickened, and the killers laughed somewhere in the distance, free to keep living. The Browns massacre became exactly what no case should ever be, a scar everyone could see, but no one could explain. For 9 years, the Browns chicken case festered. It slipped into the category of unsolved, that bureaucratic graveyard where hope goes to die. Detectives retired. Families buried their grief under layers of silence. The boarded-up restaurant became an eyesore, a local reminder that justice had skipped town. Palatine lived with its ghost, and for nearly a decade, the killers seemed untouchable. Then came the confession. In 2002, a woman named Lockett walked into the police station carrying the kind of story that flips a cold case upside down. For years, she had lived with secret, whispered to her in confidence by two men she once trusted. She told police that her former boyfriend, James Degorski, and his friend Juan had boasted about killing 7 people at Brown's Chicken. They didn't tell her with guilt or hesitation. They told her with pride, like two men bragging about a high score in a video game. Detectives, skeptical but desperate, reopened the files. Lockett's account matched details never released to the public. The freezer, the bodies, even the number of victims. Still, stories are only stories until science backs them up. That's when investigators reach for the forgotten clue, the greasy chicken bone stored since 1993. This time, the technology had caught up. DNA testing, sharper and more reliable, was applied to the bone. And there it was. Juan Luna's genetic fingerprint stamped across the evidence, like a signature scrawled in grease. After 9 years of dead ends, the case had cracked open with a soundless shatter. The arrest sent shockwaves. Luna, once a Brown's employee himself, had blended back into normal life. Married father, holding down steady work. Degorski had drifted through jobs, living a shadowed existence, but still free, still smug. Neither had been under serious suspicion before Lockett spoke up. They had moved to the suburbs like ghosts, killers hiding in plain sight. But here's the breakdown. The reality of who they were was worse than any mob theory, worse than any Hollywood-style professional hitman. These were not masterminds. They were not Avengers. They were two men barely out of their teens in 1993 who decided, spur of the moment, that killing 7 people would be fun. That word, fun. They saw a restaurant full of living, breathing human beings, and they saw an opportunity for entertainment. It's hard to process, isn't it? Because human cruelty usually wears a mask: revenge, money, desperation. But here, there was no mask. Just two men who wanted to watch the world squirm under their thumb. The investigation that once seemed cursed now had its villains. But even with answers, Palatine was left staring at something worse than mystery. The revelation that senselessness can sometimes be the only motive. Justice, when it finally came, felt jagged, uneven, as if the system itself struggled to hold the weight of what these men had done. In 2002, both Juan and James Degorski were arrested. Their mug shots were chilling not because they looked like monsters, but because they didn't. They looked like anyone. Guys you'd pass in the aisles of Jewel-Osco, neighbors mowing their lawns. Ordinary masks stretched over unfathomable cruelty. Luna was the first to face trial. In 2007, prosecutors unveiled the DNA evidence from the chicken bone like a cursed relic. There was no escaping it. His saliva was there, locked in time, linking him forever to that night. The defense tried to twist it, suggesting maybe Luna had eaten chicken there on another day. But how do you explain the confession he'd spilled years earlier? How do you explain the chilling accuracy of the details in Lockett carried for nearly a decade? The jury didn't buy the excuses. Luna was convicted of 7 counts of first-degree murder. Instead of execution, he was sentenced to life without parole, a living tomb, where every day would echo with the silence he forced onto others. Degorski's trial followed in 2009. His path was more theatrical. Witnesses painted him as sadistic, brimming with pride over the massacre. Unlike Luna, he seemed almost a rebel in the spotlight, an unrepentant shadow. He, too, was convicted of all 7 killings and condemned to spend the rest of his days inside prison walls. But here's where the lingering questions bleed in. Why did they really do it? Both men gave different versions, circling around the word fun like vultures. One claimed boredom, another claimed robbery. Neither explained the hunger to extinguish 7 lives for so little. Even their families struggled to reconcile the men, They thought they knew what the killers the world now saw. And then there's a question of delay. Why 9 years? Why did the case rot in cold storage while Luna and Degorski built ordinary lives? How many family birthdays did they attend? How many holiday dinners, while their victims' families sat with empty chairs? Could the case have been solved earlier, had the technology moved faster, or the right person spoken up sooner? The resolution was satisfying in a technical sense. Convictions, sentences, no more illusions of freedom for the guilty. But in a human sense, it was hollow. 7 people were gone. Their families aged under the weight of grief. And the killers? They went on to live almost a decade of borrowed time before their reckoning. So yes, the case was closed. But the wound it left behind never was. The Brown's Chicken Massacre didn't just scar families. It rewired an entire community. Palatine, once the poster child of suburban safety, became synonymous with dread. Parents who used a joke about their kids' part-time jobs now looked at fryer oil and cash registers as symbols of danger. Every late-night closing shift in Illinois carried the echo of what happened on January 8, 1993. The Ellenfeld daughters lost both parents in one night. Imagine that. Coming home to a house that would never be whole again, forced to inherit grief as their permanent roommate. For the teenagers' families, the ache was worse. Michael Castro was only 16. His father, a police officer himself, had to live with the unbearable irony that his profession couldn't save his own son. How do you keep wearing the badge when it failed you in the most personal way possible? The Browns building became a cursed monument. People couldn't eat there anymore, not even after the franchise tried to scrub it clean. The grease and blood had seeped into the floorboards of the town's memory. Eventually, the restaurant was torn down, replaced by something forgettable. But forgetfulness isn't the same as healing. Ask anyone who lived in Palatine then. The shadow of that boarded-up building still looms, even if the structure itself is gone. And the legacy reached further. Fast food chains across America quietly shifted their security policies. Panic buttons, stricter closing procedures, better cameras. It was never publicly branded as the Browns' effect. But insiders knew. The massacre forced an industry to admit its vulnerability. For law enforcement, the case became a study in patience and forensic evolution. That chicken bone, carelessly tossed into the trash by a killer who thought he was untouchable, proved the value of preserving even the smallest piece of evidence. The Palatine Police Department now teaches recruits about it, a grim lesson that a scrap of food can be the hinge between justice and silence. But the darker legacy lives in the psychology of the crime. Luna and Degorski weren't desperate men. They weren't hardened professionals. They were ordinary, too ordinary. They carried out mass murder not for wealth, not for revenge, but because they could, because it amused them. That truth left behind a cultural splinter. If killers like that can exist in a town like Palatine, what's stopping them from existing anywhere? Decades later, the name Brown's Chicken no longer makes people think of fried food. It makes them think of 7 coffins, of wasted youth, of grieveless cruelty. The kind of cruelty that strips away every illusion of safety suburbia once promised. Here's the detail that won't leave me alone. The killers didn't rush. They didn't panic. They stayed long enough to sit down and eat. Picture that. 7 lives ended, and instead of fleeing into night, they lingered in the fluorescent glow, chewing on drumsticks, licking grease from their fingers, while bodies cooled just a few feet away. That grotesque calm is the truest window into their minds. It tells us that evil doesn't always look frantic or chaotic. Sometimes it looks casual, almost bored. It looks like 2 young men wiping their mouths with napkins, tossing chicken bones into the trash, and strolling out as if the world weren't dripping in silence behind them. And that's what stays haunting about Browns. Not just the brutality, not just the loss, but the sheer ordinariness of the men who caused it. They weren't strangers from some nightmare realm. They were sons, neighbors, former employees, men who carried within them a bottomless void that suburbia never saw coming. The freezer in Palatine became a kind of shrine to that truth. When the door swung open and police flashlights revealed the stacked bodies, it wasn't just death they saw. It was a collapse of certainty. The certainty that hard work keeps you safe, that routine protects you, that violence belongs to other places, other people. There's no tidy lesson here. No moral that patches the wound. Just a reminder that the line between safety and horror is thinner than we want to admit. Sometimes it's the thickness of a freezer door. Sometimes it's the skin of a chicken bone holding saliva that, years later, becomes justice. When people talk about Palatine now, it's rarely about the weather or the schools or the commuter trains to Chicago. It's about that night in 1993 when ordinary lives collided with extraordinary cruelty. A reminder carved into the town's identity that even the most forgettable places can host unforgettable darkness. So maybe the reflection isn't about the killers at all. Maybe it's about us, our fragile illusions, our hunger to believe in safety, our desperate need to explain the inexplicable. Brown's Chicken leaves us with the worst kind of truth. Sometimes there is no explanation, no neat motive, no way to make sense of the senseless. All that remains is the echo of silence and the greasy fingerprints of men who thought they'd gotten away with it. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.